In 2024, Microsoft signed a deal to restart a nuclear power plant. Not to generate electricity for homes or hospitals. Not even for its own offices. The entire reactor, 835 megawatts of continuous baseload power, was dedicated to one purpose: keeping data centers running. That same year, Amazon paid $650 million for a campus sitting next to a different nuclear plant in Pennsylvania, because the only asset they really cared about was not the buildings. It was the power connection. When tech giants start funding nuclear restarts to supply their server rooms, something economically unusual is happening. The question is, what exactly? Most people have a rough picture of what a data center is. A big building. Rows of servers. Blinking lights. Air conditioning running constantly. That picture is not wrong, but it misses something important. If you walked up to a data center from the outside, you would see a concrete box. Maybe the size of several football fields. No windows. A fence. Probably a sign with a company name you have never heard of. It looks boring. It looks like a warehouse. But that warehouse might have cost $1 billion to build. And it is not really in the real estate business. Here is the core thing that data center economics rests on. A data center does not sell computing power. It does not own the servers inside it. It does not run the software. It does not store your photos or stream your videos directly. What a data center operator sells is guaranteed, uninterrupted, conditioned electrical power, delivered to the exact square foot where a tenant's servers are sitting. Think of it less like a hotel and more like an electrical utility with extremely high reliability standards. The tenant, Microsoft, Amazon, an AI startup, a major bank, brings their own servers, their own storage arrays, their own networking equipment. What they are paying for is the assurance that those machines will receive clean, stable power every single second, and that if the grid goes down, backup systems kick in within milliseconds. That is the product. Power delivery. Guaranteed. Because the product is power, the unit of currency in this business is the kilowatt, or at scale, the megawatt. Leases in the data center industry are priced in dollars per kilowatt per month. A tenant says, "I need 10 megawatts of guaranteed power capacity for my servers." And the data center operator responds with a monthly rate. In the largest market in the world, Northern Virginia, that rate in 2025 and 2026 has been running between $155 and $235 per kilowatt per month, depending on the size of the lease and the contract terms. 1 megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts. So 10 megawatts of leased capacity, at those rates, generates somewhere between $18 million and $28 million in annual revenue. And here is the part that matters. The tenant pays that rate whether or not their servers are running at full capacity. They are paying for the reservation of power. The right to draw it. Not just the electricity consumed. Now let us look at what it actually costs to create that product. To build a 100 megawatt data center, a moderately large, utility-scale facility, you are looking at an all-in capital cost of roughly $900 million to $1.2 billion. Based on industry benchmarks, that is approximately $9 to $12 million per megawatt installed. The breakdown is counterintuitive. The building itself, the concrete structure, the steel frame, the roof, the walls, the raised floors, accounts for only about 12 to 15% of total cost. Call it $110 to $150 million. The expensive part is not the box. It is everything that makes the electricity safe and reliable. Electrical infrastructure, high-voltage substations, transformers, switchgear, power distribution equipment, and uninterruptible power supply systems eats up roughly 42 to 48% of the budget. That is $400 to $520 million on electrical alone. Cooling and mechanical systems come next. Chillers, heat exchangers, cooling towers, computer room air handlers, and increasingly, direct liquid cooling infrastructure for high-density server racks. That is another 18 to 24%, or $180 to $260 million. Emergency backup generation accounts for another 12 to 16%. A 100 megawatt facility might run 40 to 50 industrial generators, each capable of producing 2.5 to 3 megawatts, with enough fuel stored on site to run independently for 72 hours. And then there are the interconnection fees, the deposits, studies, and line extension costs paid directly to the regional electric utility just to get that 100 megawatts connected to the grid in the first place. That alone can run $45 to $80 million. Land, maybe 30 to 60 acres of properly zoned industrial land near transmission infrastructure, might be only 3 to 6% of total cost. So when someone says they are building a data center, the actual investment is overwhelmingly in high-voltage electrical equipment and thermal management systems. The concrete box is almost incidental. There is another thing buried in that capital cost that most people overlook. Getting permission to connect to the grid is not a formality. High-voltage step-up transformers, the critical equipment that interfaces a data center's internal power system with the regional transmission grid, currently have manufacturing lead times of 36 to 48 months. Nearly 3 to 4 years just for the equipment. Regional grid operators in the United States, PJM in the Mid-Atlantic, ERCOT in Texas, CAISO in California, have interconnection queues measured in years. Getting approval for a 200 megawatt connection can take 4 to 7 years from application to energization. This changes the entire logic of data center development. The most economically valuable thing a developer can control is not a good piece of real estate. It is an approved, energized, or nearly energized utility connection. A mediocre piece of land with 100 megawatts of immediate available grid capacity is worth dramatically more than a prime location with a 5-year wait. In Northern Virginia, where more than 300 data centers process roughly 70% of global internet traffic, vacancy rates dropped to below 0.5% by 2026. And wholesale lease rates surged by 40 to 60%, not because buildings became scarce, but because power became impossible to obtain quickly. Now let us look at the operating model, because it is structured to eliminate a major risk: electricity costs. In a standard wholesale data center lease, electricity is what is called a pass-through. The operator installs sub-metering for each tenant. The tenant pays for the actual electricity consumed by their servers, plus a proportional share of cooling overhead. The way cooling overhead is measured is through power usage effectiveness. Modern, well-run data centers have a power usage effectiveness score of about 1.15 to 1.25. That means for every kilowatt the servers consume, the facility uses an additional 15 to 25% running the cooling systems and electrical distribution. In a triple net lease structure, the operator passes all of that through to the tenant. If the utility charges 7 cents per kilowatt hour and the power usage effectiveness multiplier is 1.2, the tenant is billed 8.4 cents. The operator collects the spread that covers their own electrical overhead, but bears no commodity price exposure. This matters because electricity is enormous. A 100 megawatt data center running at high utilization might consume 700 to 800 million kilowatt hours per year. At even 7 cents per kilowatt hour, that is $50 to $56 million annually in power costs. If the operator had to absorb that directly on a fixed revenue contract, it would completely alter the risk profile of the business. By passing it through, the operator concentrates on what they can control, delivering the power guarantee, and maintaining the physical infrastructure that makes that guarantee possible. So what does the operator actually pay out of pocket after construction? For our 100 megawatt illustrative facility, the operating cost structure looks roughly like this based on industry benchmarks. Property taxes, assessed on a $1 billion industrial facility, run approximately $14 million per year. Staffing round-the-clock facilities engineering teams to monitor and maintain the electrical, cooling, and security systems costs around $5 million annually. Preventative maintenance on the chillers, generators, battery systems, and all the mechanical infrastructure comes to roughly $6.5 million per year. Specialized property and business interruption insurance, because a data center outage can trigger contractual service level agreement penalties with enterprise clients, runs approximately $4 million per year. Physical security, including biometric access systems and on-site personnel, is around $3.5 million. Cooling water treatment and chemical programs, necessary for maintaining chiller performance and preventing bacterial growth in cooling towers, adds about $2.5 million. And corporate overhead and asset management brings the total to approximately $39 million per year in non-power operating expenses. On a facility generating $204 million in gross capacity revenue, 100,000 kilowatts at $170 per kilowatt per month, that produces a net operating income of approximately $165 million per year. That is a net operating income margin of roughly 80%. For comparison, a well-run commercial office building might achieve a 50 to 60% operating margin. A high-quality apartment building may be 55 to 65%. An 80% margin is a property type with very few peers. So how does the investment actually work? Build cost, $1 billion for 100 megawatts. Debt financing, at a typical 65% loan-to-cost ratio, supplies $650 million. At current project finance rates of around 6.5% on a 15-year amortizing loan, that is annual debt service of approximately $68.5 million. The equity check from the sponsor is $350 million. Gross revenue at full lease-up, $204 million per year. Operating expenses, $39 million per year. Net operating income, $165 million per year. Minus debt service, $68.5 million. Net cash flow to equity, approximately $96.5 million annually. On a $350 million equity investment, that is roughly a 27.5% annual cash-on-cash return. And the development yield on total cost, net operating income divided by total capital expenditure, is approximately 16.5%, well above the 8 to 11% historical range before AI-driven demand accelerated. Those numbers explain why institutional capital is pursuing this asset class aggressively. But they assume one critical thing: the building is fully leased. A data center operator's single biggest risk is not construction cost overruns or equipment failure. It is the gap between when the building is ready and when it is generating revenue. Unlike software businesses, a data center has enormous fixed costs that run from day one of operations. Property taxes do not care whether you have tenants. Insurance premiums do not care. Generator maintenance does not care. Debt service absolutely does not care. The moment construction is complete, the clock starts. This is why large-scale data center development almost always involves pre-leasing. Sophisticated operators sign lease agreements with hyperscale tenants, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Meta, before the building is finished, often before construction even begins. In the tightest markets, most new capacity is spoken for before a single foundation is poured. That is how constrained supply has become. For a developer without those relationships, or building on speculation, carrying a 100-megawatt facility at partial occupancy is painful. At 50% occupancy, the revenue base is roughly $102 million, but the operating and debt service costs are still $107.5 million. The facility loses money on a levered basis until occupancy climbs. Every percentage point of utilization is worth approximately $2 million per year in additional revenue. Now here is where the economics get genuinely strange. For years, a data center was designed around a simple assumption: each server rack draws somewhere between 5 and 15 kilowatts of power. Fill the building with racks, fill the racks with servers, and you have deployed your capacity. The NVIDIA GPU revolution broke that assumption completely. Modern AI training clusters, systems built around NVIDIA H100, H200, or Blackwell processor chips, draw 40 to 100 kilowatts per rack, sometimes more. And they require direct liquid cooling, with coolant delivered directly to the chip via pipes rather than blowing air across it. A data center designed for 5 kilowatts per rack and standard air cooling infrastructure cannot simply be retrofitted for 80 kilowatt GPU racks. The electrical circuits cannot carry it. The cooling infrastructure cannot reject the heat. Consider the math. A 10-megawatt legacy data center assumed it could house roughly 2,000 server racks. An AI operator installs GPU clusters drawing 80 kilowatts each. They fill 125 racks and hit the facility's entire 10-megawatt electrical limit. They have occupied 6,000 square feet of floor space in a building with 50,000 square feet. The remaining 44,000 square feet of perfectly good data center floor, white space, in industry terms, sits completely empty. Not because no one wants it, but because the substation is fully loaded. There is no power left to run more equipment. The space is structurally stranded. This paradox is reshaping the value of legacy data center buildings. Facilities built before the AI density inflection can face a situation where their floor space becomes effectively worthless not through obsolescence of the building itself, but through obsolescence of its electrical and cooling infrastructure. This brings us back to Amazon and the nuclear plant. The fundamental constraint driving data center economics today is not capital. It is not land. It is not labor. It is certified, immediately available, large-scale electrical power. In Pennsylvania's PJM grid territory, getting approval to connect a new 200 to 400 megawatt load can take 4 to 7 years through normal interconnection channels. In Northern Virginia, Dominion Energy has warned that substation connection delays in the most congested corridors could run until 2027 or 2028. Amazon's acquisition of the Cumulus data center campus adjacent to the Susquehanna nuclear generating station in Pennsylvania for $650 million in March 2024 was not primarily a real estate transaction. It was an attempt to bypass 4 to 7 years of grid interconnection queue by connecting directly behind the meter at the power plant, before the electricity ever touches the transmission grid. Microsoft's 20-year agreement to fund the restart of the closed 3 Mile Island reactor, securing 835 megawatts of dedicated nuclear power, follows the same logic. The economics of AI infrastructure are so driven by power scarcity that restarting a decommissioned nuclear facility became cost-competitive with waiting in the interconnection queue. The federal regulator, FERC, ultimately blocked the expansion of Amazon's Susquehanna arrangement beyond 300 megawatts, citing concerns that other grid users would effectively be subsidizing a single corporation's power bypass. The regulatory collision was predictable. When one company's data center campus attempts to commandeer the direct output of a major nuclear plant, the rest of the ratepayer community has opinions. There is one more resource constraint that rarely appears in the financial press: water. Traditional data center cooling relies heavily on evaporative cooling, water that absorbs heat and then evaporates, carrying that heat away from the facility. A 100 megawatt data center using evaporative cooling can consume up to 1 to 2 million gallons of water per day. In regions already facing water scarcity, Arizona, parts of Texas, southern Spain, Chile, Ireland, local governments are beginning to impose development moratoriums on new data center construction specifically because of water draw. This is pushing operators toward closed-loop and direct liquid cooling systems that recirculate coolant rather than evaporating it. Those systems are more expensive to build and maintain, adding further pressure to the capital expenditure structure. It is another variable that a data center economics model has to internalize, and another dimension in which site selection has become increasingly constrained. So where can the economics break? The most visible risk is lease-up speed. A building that comes online without pre-committed tenants starts burning cash immediately. The capital structure allows limited runway. The second risk is tenant credit and contract structure. A wholesale data center operator is fundamentally dependent on a small number of extremely large counterparties. If Microsoft or Amazon chooses not to renew a 10-year lease at expiration, the revenue impact is severe. Third is technology disruption. The shift from air-cooled cloud servers to liquid-cooled AI clusters is creating an entirely new category of stranded asset. Buildings that cost hundreds of millions to build may struggle to command their original economics if their power and cooling infrastructure is mismatched with next-generation compute requirements. Fourth is regulatory and utility risk. Interconnection terms change. Regulators can intervene in unusual supply arrangements, as the regulatory ruling on Amazon's Susquehanna deal demonstrated. Municipal governments can impose new taxes on data center electricity consumption, as some jurisdictions have considered. Fifth is the grid itself. Even a data center with exceptional backup generation depends on long-term grid stability for its primary power supply. Extreme weather events, transmission failures, or deliberate attacks represent tail risks that no operator can fully eliminate. Here is what the economics of a data center resolve to at the end of the analysis. The business is not about real estate. The building is a shell. The real asset is a certified, energized connection to the power grid and the engineering infrastructure to guarantee that power is delivered without interruption at industrial scale to whoever rents the floor space inside. The margins on that guarantee are extremely high, net operating income margins approaching 80%, because the product is genuinely difficult to replicate. You can build another concrete box in months. You cannot get another 100 megawatt grid interconnection in less than 4 to 7 years. The capital requirement is genuinely enormous. $1 billion to produce 100 megawatts of leasable capacity before a single server is installed. The servers, the actual computing hardware, are the tenant's investment, potentially several billion more. And the underlying constraint that is reshaping the entire industry right now is that the demand for power, driven by AI infrastructure build-out, has grown faster than the electrical grid can provision new capacity. The companies spending the most on data center power are now directly shaping energy infrastructure policy, energy markets, and in some cases restarting decommissioned nuclear reactors because the alternative is waiting years for the grid to catch up. The most boring-looking building in your industrial park might be one of the most economically complex assets in the modern infrastructure landscape. The value is not in the walls. It is in what is running through the cables buried underneath.